Hello. Today we are gonna read the short novel Beaver Soup by JohnofE. Recipe Part 1. The Tipping Point. In suburban West Auckland, at 2:37 a.m. on a Saturday night, John Foster slouched over his ergonomic keyboard, staring with bloodshot eyes into the wild LCD monitor. Image after image scrolled by as he browsed F-Chan's alternate hard channel, looking for more drawings of male-on-male dog porn. This night was no different to any other Saturday night in the past few years of John's life. He lived for the midnight lurking and the midday breakfast. John clicked over to the Media Watch website, having found nothing interesting at F-Chan. He skimmed over the latest slander and was ready to move on when he saw it. The angry beavers back to the wild. John's eyes widened as he clicked the link and was presented with the news he thought would never come. Norbert and Daggett Beaver, once stars of their hit reality TV show The Angry Beavers, are moving the dam. Norb and Dag had become obscure stars in recent years due to their agreement with wildlife expert Senior Bill Leaking. Mr. Leaking also had other shows featuring certain forest animals in their natural habitats, filmed with numerous strategically placed cameras. Norbert and Daggett were a breath of fresh air for the show's producers, with their furious arguments and electric personalities. They were the perfect reality show recipe and brought great ratings. 6 months ago, their series of 3 years finally came to an end, prompting the Beavers to move the dam and start living normal lives again. John felt a rush of excitement come over him as he finished reading the article. It was finally happening. This was the change he had been waiting for so long. His dream might actually come true. John turned off the computer and climbed into bed. Thoughts of gratification swirled around inside his head as he turned out the light and pulled the covers over him and his Norbert plushie. A sense of adventure and purpose welled up in him, and he lay in the dark, smiling. He cuddled his beaver plush tightly and kissed its soft, furry nose. John was a die-hard fan of the show, but mostly because of Norbert Beaver. There was once a time where he simply loved the show, but since the first season, he began obsessing about it greatly. John was at the point now where he believed that he has a connection of some sort with Norbert, and that they were destined to be together. There were times when his thoughts seemed like the ravings of an obsessed lunatic, and even though he knew it was mad, he ignored this dangerous fact and continued to fixate on Norbert in a frightening manner. 3 years has passed since the show hit the air, and John's obsession had grown to disastrous proportions in that time. Even after its demise, his undying love for Norbert Beaver burned hot in him. The usual stereotype appearance of a complete nutter didn't apply to John. He looked common and trustworthy. He stood 6 foot 5 inches, had short, dark brown hair and hazel eyes. His skin was parched white and his face shaven, dressed in blue jeans, white shirt and brown leather shoes. John looked completely plain. In his young years he was bullied horribly, but this only thickened his skin and made him despise the human race to the point of disconnection. John enjoyed being completely alone. Without any friends, he was free to spend all his spare time obsessing over his only friend in the world, a friend who didn't even know he existed. John's personality was rather normal. He functioned well in society and worked in one of Auckland's largest electrical wholesalers, on the customer service desk with reasonable success. He sometimes resented the job due to the fact he had to be exposed to so many people, but his emotional disconnection with humans allowed him to operate more effectively with his customers. much to his own disdain. Nothing touched him. From the outside, John was a normal Kiwi bloke. But if you managed to crack his shell, you'd faint from the mess that would spill out. Paraphilia was the quirk that defined him the most. The sexual interest in non-human subjects. His interest varied from corpophilia to necrophilia, and so many others in between. One that haunted him the most was bestiality. John hungered desperately to have sex with what he would refer to as a nice, big, bushy-tailed Labrador. Putain de merde. Ayez pitié de nous, Seigneur. Any large breed of working dog would work for John, but John's main problem with that attraction was there was no means to satisfy it. He had thought of so many avenues for acquiring his fair game, but it was all too hard. As of yet, he had not managed to have sex with a dog, but eventually that day would come, he promised himself it would. John often wondered about his sexuality and how it came to be, how he could be homosexual but not interested in human males. During times of unbearable sexual frustration, he would visit a sex club downtown and get fucked by whoever would offer it. He enjoyed giving other men the pleasure of violating his young and slender body. It was the only human and living sexual contact he could ever get easily. Of all the sexual perversion that filled John's mind, Norbert was the most special. Norbert really meant something to him. John was convinced that this was true love for real. Even if Norbert didn't love him back, John knew in his heart that he could never love someone as he loved Norbert Beaver. Since the first season of the Beavers show, John drew pictures of Norbert almost every day. On occasion, John would draw Norbert in horrific circumstances. He liked to imagine hurting him, but never considered doing it for real. It was his way of relieving the resentment he felt for Norbert being so unreachable. Most of the drawings, however, were nice in nature. John had recorded the entire TV series on his computer and captured hundreds and hundreds of still shots from the video. His room was practically wallpapered with prints of Norbert as a result. A year into John's obsession, he constructed a life-size stuffed animal in Norbert's likeness. He spent hours perfecting it, and upon completing it, he had become John's most prized possession. Complete with yellow acrylic fur, purple satin nose, and brown felt tail, it was John's best friend, and he would make passionate love to it every night. Out of his desire to be understood, John made himself a website under the alias name JohnofE.com. He hosted all his images and wrote lengthy papers about himself in a bid to explain his situation, in hopes that someone with the same issue might come into his life. Instead, he found that most people who came to the site were horrified by him, and he became a freak show for people to laugh at and talk about. John, being resilient to criticism, found this attention more entertaining rather than offensive, and became drawn to pissing people off. There was a group that he fitted in with, the furry community. These people were not necessarily similar to John, but most of them accepted him. But there was a portion that didn't. John was just glad to have a label to identify himself with. He was a furry, even if a lot of what he stood for didn't make him so. John was incredibly self-aware and egotistical. He enjoyed fixating on himself and his paraphiliac interest and trying to find cause for it all, but the answer to why never did come. Some things just cannot be explained. In the past, John sought psychiatric help for his sexual obsessions and paraphilia, but was unsuccessful. He was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, along with being sexually deviant. The doctors couldn't figure out what may have caused him to be that way, but offered help in the form of chemical castration drugs. John decided to give being normal a go, but quickly found that he couldn't do it and accepted his love for Norbert completely, continuing his obsessive, deluded love for the Beaver. John often played with the idea of flying out to visit Norbert in America. It was tempting, but the Beaver's current location was inconvenient. Situated in part of a populated town, it would be disastrous if anything went wrong. John knew he was dangerous and didn't plan of going all the way to America to be rejected. He had a plan for any outcome and he simply couldn't risk getting caught if he had to resort to violence. John liked to wonder what would happen if he met Norbert, whether Norbert would accept John or reject him, and how he himself would react to the rejection, as well as the consequences. John didn't like to admit it to himself, but he assumed Norbert would most likely not be happy with his request for instant love and gratification. John imagined many scenarios where he would end up neck-deep in proverbial shit. It became depressing, so he didn't dwell on it too often. After reading the article on the Beavers' move back in the wild, John soon found the location of their new dam and was delighted at the remoteness of it. The risk he had been worried about for so long was no longer a factor, and John proceeded to arrange his departure from New Zealand in pursuit of Norbert Beaver. With quick succession, John sold his Auckland house to an agent. The price was such that it sold instantly, and although John came out worst off, but he needed the money for this trip, and he was committed to achieving his goal. With the money, John acquired a visitor's visa to America and a one-way ticket on the condition that he had the funds to return to New Zealand. Having sold his home, there was no issue proving he had the necessary funds to return, and John was soon sitting in a 747 on his way to meet the love of his life. Before his departure, John managed to organize his living arrangement in America, much to his luck. The new dam's location provided John with a freak blessing, a large house that was once used for logging sessions. John didn't believe in fate, but this rattled him for at least a day. It was just too perfect. The forest was big, but many years from being felled again, and the company that owned the land were more than happy to rent it out for a period. The owner considered questioning it, but decided he'd rather have the money than an explanation. The same landowners has also dealt with Norbert and Daggett prior to their arrival and come to an arrangement that ensured their dam would not be disturbed by logging for at least 3 more years. It was decided that the Beavers would move to another location after the 3-year term expired. Norbert and Daggett were more than happy with this arrangement, as they never stayed in one place for more than a few years. 2 weeks had passed since John settled into his new rental property in the remote northern woods. It was a large timber dwelling in the middle of nowhere, connected to a rural highway 5 miles west by a gravel track that cut through the forest of pine trees. The nearest town was 30 miles away, giving the Beavers the isolation they longed for, unknowingly also giving John the isolation he had been hoping they would achieve. The lodge contained a large kitchen, laundry area, and 6 bedrooms with bunk beds. It provided accommodation for contractors who lived out of town and proved to be a valuable asset to the company who owned it, as it would attract many workers and competitive pay raise for them. In the end, the company would not have to pay the contractors as much as the local workers. This angered many of the local townspeople, but that's another story. Near the lodge, at the end of the grassy clearing, a small river flowed by. Only 300 meters downstream of this river resided Norbert and Daggett's new dam. Since arriving to the lodge, John took daily walks through thick bush along the river to assess the place. It was important to him that he knew the land well so that he could navigate at night. There were times where he would stand hidden in the trees, watching the dam for any movement. Some days he was lucky enough to see the beavers playing in the pond their dam had created. John enjoyed watching Norbert in the water He looked so happy as he ducked under the surface and came up again sparkling in the early morning sunlight. John came to learn that the Beavers' routine and would come just to watch Norbert and Daggett splash about in the water. 3 weeks had passed since John moved to the lodge. One fine Tuesday morning, as John loaded the industrial washer with his bedsheets, he noticed through the fog sun-struck windows 2 beavers staring at the lodge in the distance. Startled by this unexpected appearance, John stepped to the side to avoid being seen. Slowly, John inched to the window and peered through the hazy glass. The beavers appeared to be talking to each other. John hoped they hadn't seen him. It wouldn't have mattered much, but he wasn't ready for a confrontation. He would later regret not letting them see him, as it might have saved him a whole lot of effort in the future. After a few moments, Norbert and Daggett moved on, and John never saw them walk by the lodge again. With a sigh, he resumed loading the washer and made himself breakfast.